This is Apropos. The island economy was already struggling under the burden of decades of US sanctions, but the situation in Cuba has rapidly deteriorated since Donald Trump signed an executive order threatening to impose tariffs on countries that sell or provide oil to the Caribbean nation. As airlines suspend flights to the island, long queues are forming at gas stations with fewer buses running, power cuts hitting homes, hospitals and other state institutions. Emerald Maxwell has the latest.
In the streets of Havana, coal cellars are everywhere. Amid power outages lasting up to 10 hours and as shortages of fuel, food and medicine begin to bite, hard-pressed Cubans are having to be resourceful.
The situation is getting even more complicated than it was, so we're out looking for coal. Our budget doesn't stretch to an electric generator or an EcoFlow battery, or anything like that. Charcoal is the most affordable option. It's not exactly cheap, but at least it solves the problem.
No foreign fuel or oil tanker has arrived in Cuba in weeks, meaning many are resorting to cooking with coal. Those who can afford it, meanwhile, have been turning to solar panels. Installers have seen demand go through the roof.
These last few weeks and months have been incredible in terms of the sheer level of demand.
Since US President Donald Trump severed the island's access to its primary petroleum sources in Venezuela and Mexico, the Cuban government has brought in emergency measures to ration what fuel is left and ease blackouts that are affecting everything from homes to hospitals. They've shuttered universities, reduced school hours and the work week, and slashed public transport, leaving Cubans stranded and worried.
I've got a trip to make and everything's been canceled. There's nothing. We're stuck here, and what's worse is the helplessness about what's going to happen, the uncertainty.
The crisis also threatens to cut Cuba off from another vital economic lifeline, that of tourism, which looks set to continue its plummet after Cuban officials warned airlines that they wouldn't be able to refuel their planes on the island for at least a month.
For more, we're joined now by Lillian Guerra, Professor of Cuban and Caribbean History at the University of Florida. Lillian, thanks so much for being with us on the programme. We saw there in that report just how ordinary people have been struggling over the last couple of days particularly. Talk to us a little bit more about how this crisis is affecting people there. As we know, long before this current situation, it's been very, very difficult economically speaking for the government in Cuba.
Yes, I would say that some of the images that you showed were a bit misleading. Most Cubans would not be able to buy solar panels. Most Cubans are not even able to leave their homes. We have a situation that today is far more dire than any situation Cuba has faced in the last century. Currently, the situation is such that, we have 90% of the food having been imported to Cuba now for years. I mean, that statistic, is an official one since at least 2018, 2019. And then, the fiddling with the currency to make it a one island currency provoked tremendous inflation in the economy. That was coupled with a drastic efforts, I would say, on the part of the military to further control the tourist trade and to control, more importantly, not just scarcity. That means distribution of goods by forcing people to buy them with a sort of ATM card instead of just freely buying them with currency in state stores, but also controlling what is the state sector of private enterprise, these small little businesses, which are now really subject to a kind of politicization and loyalty test that they frankly were not subject to, even 10 years ago. So we have a situation that I think really doesn't resemble anything we've seen before. It's far worse in some ways than what happened in the early years after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, many observers saying this is the worst crisis in Cuba's modern history. Sounds like you would agree with that. Why exactly, Lillian, is this happening now? Why is Washington claiming that Cuba poses a threat to US national security, as Donald Trump claims?
Well, Donald Trump is going to claim that because he's interested in two things. He's interested in reversing the course of history, and he's interested in real estate. So, I don't think that Cuba is representing now more than it ever has a national security threat. I think that's an excuse in order to enable him to then prevent any fuel from arriving in Cuba. And Cuba is utterly dependent, has been for years, on Venezuelan fuel. In fact, it wasn't just using it for its own purposes, it was reselling much of the fuel that it received from Venezuela in order to secure more hard currency on the world market, and then be able to fund its own businesses. The state-owned sector of the economy really employs about 85% of Cubans. So we don't have a situation drastically different than we did under, we could say, the height of communism in the 1980s. The big difference is that since 2009, when Raul Castro formally took power from Fidel through the present, we have the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias, which is the armed forces of Cuba, really controlling the state capitalist economy. And I know this might be confusing for people, but effectively the government has survived because it adopted capitalism in 1991, and it controlled that capitalism. It managed it. And so today we have a situation where the military owns the vast majority of the tourist base of the economy. It has doubled the number of hotels in the last 5 years. And it also is an extremely corrupt military that has no accountability. There's no transparency with regard to even how it pays itself. The CEOs are generals and other high-ranking officers. Now, this is not a threat to the United States. This is simply, in fact, a kind of right-wing military authoritarian dictatorship that is the kind of dictatorship that the United States historically has liked to work with in Latin America. So I actually find it really scary that we have the Trump administration, in the wake of what has happened in Venezuela, making gestures towards negotiating, in quotes, with the Cuban government. Because a transition under Trump would really be no transition at all for the Cuban people. It may very well satisfy some of his demands and would satisfy the need for the military to maintain itself in power, perhaps on the excuse that it maintains order in the country.
And yeah, because we've heard Donald Trump warning Cuba to strike a deal without really going into much detail about what exactly he's seeking there. Is Washington ultimately striving for regime change? And you mentioned Venezuela there. Are there real fears in Cuba that there might be a similar scenario about to play out there?
Yes, well, I would say first that on the island, there is tremendous outrage over the hypocrisy of the Cuban government. That has been the case now for decades, but it certainly has reached a sort of blowing point in the last few years. We've seen 2 million Cubans leave in between 2021, 2022, and the present, at least. That is at least, 20% of the population has gone. 800,000 of them came to South Florida. And this exodus is the largest exodus ever seen in the history of the revolution. I mean, the height of immigration that occurred in the 60s never topped 1 million people. Between 1959 and 1979, you got about a 700,000 person exodus over that whole long decade. So what we have today is really unprecedented. I think that it's a very fragile situation. The government has no legitimacy. Miguel Díaz-Canel has no legitimacy. Raul Castro never did. And you have a very vulnerable population because it has been stripped of its ability to fight for its own economic security, to compete with state industries as entrepreneurs, and to really get ahead. And there was a window in which that was happening. That was certainly happening, as I witnessed it, between around 2011 and 2017. And as often happens, when the hard line in the United States shuts the door to any reforms to the embargo, to any opening of relations, that serves the Cuban state, because then they can go back and say that it's the United States' fault for all of its own mismanagement, corruption, and lack of accountability. There were many, many hardliners who were jumping for joy in Cuba, in the government, when Trump took power the first time. I think they're certainly not jumping for joy now. But that doesn't mean that this kind of regime change will not be in some ways embraced on the island by people who are fed up. I think that that's a dangerous reality, because if there is a regime change that is forced on the Cuban people through the Trump administration, and I would say that would not happen by landing troops on the ground. That would happen by perhaps extracting Raúl Castro and some other symbolic heads of state like Miguel Díaz-Canel, but leaving intact the military. And then we really do have a situation of an official military dictatorship, and those are very, very hard to collapse, especially when they have the support of the United States. That's a dream situation for people interested in investment in Cuba and in sort of turning back the clock. And that is certainly what Trump wants. He wants to reverse history, both for his understanding of the United States, as well as power in places like Cuba, where the United States has largely been absent as a player and certainly as an investment force. Even in the 90s, when Cuba did turn to foreign investment and to joint ventures between the government and big-time corporations, multinationals abroad.
Lillian, lots to discuss, but we're out of time, unfortunately. Thanks so much for being with us on the programme, though. That's Lillian Guerra, Professor of Cuban and Caribbean History at the University of Florida. Thank you. Well, that's
Thank
it.
you so much.
Thank you.